quick reminder for ogives, um, slightly different than a histogram in that we get relative standings, or something you're probably a lot more familiar with, which is percentiles, especially in terms of maybe a lot of you guys are familiar with, like if you're in the 90th percentile of a test, that means that you have scored better than 90% of the people. So this is information that you can pull from what's called an ogive. So to create an ogive, some of the terms that'll get thrown around, relative frequency, which is really just a big way of saying a percent, right? So it's bin count divided by total count. Cumulative frequency, right? This just means you're going to add up frequencies, and then finally you put it all together, relative cumulative frequencies. This is just adding up the percentages as you go. So what that'll look like for you guys, um, uh, think back about the SAT score. So we had the 1300 to 1399, the 1400 bin, the 1500 bin, the 1600 bin, the 1700 bin. All right. So we had these bins that we dealt with um, over the past couple days. And so the frequencies that each of those occurred, kind of running out of room, the frequencies, um, if you'll recall, there was 4 schools in that particular range, 2 schools between 14 and 15, 6, 7, and 1. So the relative frequency, that's just turning these into percentages. So 4 out of the total of 20, right? There are 20 total schools here. 2 out of 20. You get 6 out of 20, 7 out of 20, and then 1 out of 20. So to turn it into a relative frequency, just go ahead and get the percentage. So 20% of schools in Wake County were between 13 and 1400. 10% of schools were between 14 and 15. And then just keep working your way down, and you end up with 5% of schools between 17 and 1799. So to create this ogive, we're going to use the frequencies, but we need to do it like in order to really use those effectively. That's where we got to use the relative cumulative frequencies. Sometimes people, they might call that the CRF. They might turn relative cumulative into cumulative relative, but really all that's telling you is we just want to go, as we go through this, you just want to keep accumulating. So 20% of schools were below 1400. You add the next 10%, 30% of the schools were at 1499 or below. Keep working your way through, and really all we're doing is we're just adding the next one. So that 60% is the 30% plus the 10% plus the 20%. So here's the idea, that percentile. It's getting everything from where you are and back. And so you keep working your way up, and your RCF row should end up at 100%. So here's what we're actually going to use to create that ogive. We're going to use, look at this, the x-axis, that's going to be our original data, just like our bins and the histogram. But the y-axis is going to be that RCF. Again, some people might also call this CRF, depending upon what text or what website you're looking at. And to really create this thing, this is kind of a confusing statement right here. And so the way that I think about this is what percent is below your current value. All right, and so to finish off the ogive, we're going to connect the points to lines. So I'm going to put my sentence back here. What percent is below? Right, so let's go ahead and get this thing started. So I'm going to do my bins, the starting point of each bin. Right. I know one of the histograms yesterday had the midpoint, but this is going to be a lot easier for us. All right, so go ahead and we'll label our axes. So the y-axis here, this is going to be the RCF. I've also seen people label this as percentile, and that'll make a lot more sense here in just a minute. So this was scores, just so I'm consistent with what I told you guys. SAT scores, we'll give it a title. There we go. And so what we're going to do The question to ask again, what percentage is below? So let's start right here at the beginning. I'm thinking about this. What percent of schools were below 1,300? Well, we didn't have any. So that's going to be our jumping off point. That's going to be where the 0 is. 0% of schools were at 1,300. Now, what percentage of schools were below 1,400? Well, that would be this group right here. So that would be 20%. So at 1,400, what percentage is below? 20%. So put a point at 1,400, 20%. What percentage of schools are below 1,500? Well, that'd be everything from 1,499 and down. So that's another 30%. What percentage of schools are below a 1,600? So 1,599 and down is sitting right there. So that's 60%. Same idea. What percentage of schools scored below 1,700? That's almost all of them at 95%. And then finally, what percentage of schools were below 1,800? Well, that's all of them. So there's your 100%. So now come back and connect the dots, and you've created an ogive. Something to kind of start considering when we interpret an ogive. The steeper the section, right? So we got a couple pretty steep sections right here, right between 15 and 16 and 16 and 17. What that tells you is there's more data. Go back and look in those bins. That's where, right? You look between 15 and 16, 30% of the data, 35% of the data. Most of the data is going to be where the steep lines are. If we take a second, we look where it kind of flattens out a little bit, 17 to 1,800. Well, there was only one school. That's only 5% of the data. Right over here, it's relatively flat. Well, that's where 10% of the data is. So one of the things to consider with an ogive is as these things start to kind of level off, that tells you that there's less data in there. If all of a sudden you get a flat spot in your graph, what that'll tell you is that there's no data in that bin, right? And so where this is helpful, let's say that we wanted to find what's the 60th percentile score, right? So what we can do there is find the 60th percentile, go over, and we see that that's a score of about 1,600. Right? So that here we are with that kind of about, approximately, whatnot. Another way we could use this is what percentile is a score of, 1,550. So let's say a school averaged about 1,550. Well, the trick here, let me get rid of my other line. So go to the 1550 on the bottom row, go up, catch your line, and then work your way across. So that looks like maybe about the 45th percentile. So there's your quick look at creating the ogive. The big question for you guys, what percentage is below? And then also how to use it appropriately. So at the end of the day, one of the things, or some of the things to think about, right? Histograms and ogives both used for quantitative data. So we got another quantitative graph. And then depending upon what you want to present, what you need to show your audience, your readers, could kind of determine which type of graph you want to use in this situation. So histograms, pretty easy to construct, but making sure you set up your bins, that can be difficult sometimes, making sure you read them correctly. But a histogram also gives you a really good look at some of the biggest bins. It's easy to see where most of the data is in a histogram, and you can see where there's empty bins very quickly just because there's missing things. And you can get that information from an ogive too. However, it's a little bit tougher, right? You got to pay attention to slopes. Ogives, however, are really, really good if you want to start thinking about relative standings. And that relative standing, that's just a fancy way of saying percentiles, which you are very, very familiar with your academic careers, if you will. So depending upon what you want to get out of a graph, that would kind of determine what type of graph you'd want to use.